Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit Loving host, inviting you back to another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Meera Trehan. Meera is the author of The View from the Very Best House in Town, her debut middle grade novel that's part thriller, part friendship story, and part real estate listing. She's here today to talk about her newest middle grade book, Snow. Snow is both a beautiful and haunting fantasy where an imprisoned princess needs the help of a girl from the modern world to undo a wish gone wrong and save her snowy kingdom. There's so much beauty in this book to unpack, and I can't wait to talk to her about it. So let's get right to the episode. Meera, welcome to KidLit Love. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
I am too, especially because where I am in upstate New York, it is quite fitting to talk about a book called Snow because we still have a decent amount of it, at least at the time of recording. So the stars are aligned to chat.
So I'm in Maryland, and while I was writing the book, there wasn't a ton of snow in Maryland, but then maybe in honor of the release, there's been a lot of snow this season, to the extent that I wasn't sure if I would make some of my book events, and things had to be rescheduled because we had so much snow. But
Yes, it's the book coming to life. More about that later, though. We'll get into the story later. I would love to start with your typical introductions, and I'm hoping that you'll tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about your work, and of course, your journey to children's literature and talking about your second novel today.
sure. Unlike a lot of writers who said that they saw themselves writing books from a very early age, that was not my journey. And I want to make clear, I loved books growing up. I read voraciously, and I would even read and think, you know what, that book would be a lot better if they planted the clue in chapter 3. And so I was actively thinking about books, and I wrote a lot of poetry, and I actually memorized poems when I was young. So I definitely love literature, but I just didn't think that I could write a book, especially a really long book. And I also really wanted to be a lawyer growing up, so I could help people and fight for people's rights. And so um, that's what I did. I became a lawyer. But it was interesting in college. I could have taken a creative writing class, and I was interested in the classes, but I was also like, I don't know that I would be good enough. And I just didn't actually I took poetry writing again because I had done some of that, but I was too nervous to take, actually story writing classes. And then in law school, I was really just too busy. Although I did have friends, I have a friend who's a professional writer, and she was, writing on the side in law school. So people do it, but I did not have it in me. And again, I didn't really think it's something I'd be able to do. And so I felt like, even though I would have stories in my head and characters, it was something I should try. And so this story is not going to make me look very good, but at least somewhat self-aware. So when I was practicing, a friend of mine who knows this story, I have told it to her after the fact, and she thinks it's very funny. She was leaving the organization where we were working, and she said, well, and maybe I'll be able to write more in my time because I'm a writer. And I remember thinking, why does Shelby get to think she's a writer? luckily, she was a very nice person, and I was self-aware enough to be like, "Why am I hating on Shelby when that's all she did? I need to think about this a little bit more." And I did, which was good. And eventually, when I had time and was working less, I ended up taking a class at a local organization local to me in Bethesda, Maryland, called the Writer Center, which is a great organization. And shout out to them. And they do online classes, and I'm on the board now. But I took my very first class there, and it was just fiction writing. Like, no, I don't think it was I don't know if it was fiction writing. It might have just been like a intro to writing. So it was very, I hesitate to use the word basic, maybe broad is a better word, in the sense that, we would look at paragraphs and how is this paragraph structured versus that paragraph, or short bits of writing, or writing for alliteration, or doing different exercises, which were great. And I mean, I knew pretty much nothing about creative writing at the time, except what I like to read, which, you later learn what you like to read, and learning from what you read is maybe the most important thing, because there's no point in writing something that you wouldn't like to read, that wouldn't speak to you, um, in my opinion. Um, so, but, and maybe the second to last class, the writing teacher, she's great. We were in the parking lot, like just feeding the meter. This was before like, park mobile apps. And I said, so for the second last class, she had said, like, just talked about very basic elements of conflict in story, like in the most basic sense. And I told her, I had this idea about these two sisters. Anyway, she was like, huh. And then we went in, and it was the only time we were like really showing work to be critiqued. And I had done a picture book that was really, I still, I might have something there, but it was not good. Well, I will just say that now. I didn't know it was not good because, when you're just starting to write, it's like just starting to do anything, right? And there are probably parts of it that were good, but it wasn't good in the sense that it wasn't at a point where it could be published. That's probably a better way of saying it, as opposed to good or not. Um, and when it came my turn, how you just know you're not going to get great feedback. You just hold a pause right before it
I
comes, and
do. I do, unfortunately.
and and so, but she was really respectful. She wasn't like this. She was just like, well, what about this? And I wonder about that. But finally, then very enthusiastically, she's like, you know what you should write? You should be writing that novel you told me about, which is really funny because she's a wonderful writer, but she's a short story writer. And in one of our classes was like, oh my God, don't ever write a novel. You'll waste your time. So I was like, that's funny. One, I can't. And tell me I should never write a novel. And so I was like, that's nice. I'm never going to write a novel. I don't write long things. Like, that's just not how I write or who I am. Or um, and so it took me a lot of years to get to writing a novel, even. And but in that time, one thing, another shout out, I had a craft book I loved that had been recommended in this class called Steering the Craft by Ursula Le Guin. And I don't know, do you know that one,
I
Stephanie?
don't. No, I'm writing it down.
It's real. I love it. And it's really, I mean, any type of narrative writing could benefit from it. And I think her whole point is the more you have the tools of craft, the more you'll be able to apply them. You want them ideally sort of so embedded in you that you can just pull them out when you need them, and you're not always consciously thinking of them. So there's all sorts of exercises around word choice and sentence length and paragraph and point of view, at a really granular level, which frankly, if you're writing a novel, story and plotting is important, but none of that matters, I think, if you can't convey your feelings effectively and kind of bridge that gap between like your brain and the page. And I think that's what that book helps you do in really short, manageable chunks, which also I wasn't in a place in my life where I could necessarily sit down for hours and hours and, write and get the momentum going. But I could take 20 minutes and try to do something. So that was really helpful. So I was working through exercises. I tried to write more picture books. I went to conferences. I was kind of getting more resources. Um, I took a class at Politics and Prose, which is one of my local bookstores, a lot more at the Writer's Center. Later in this journey, I took classes and now sometimes I'm on guest faculty at the Highlights Foundation, which is another fantastic resource for people who want to write for children. So I was doing all this stuff, but I wasn't getting published. I wasn't even looking for an agent. I didn't even know anything about querying. I was just, I didn't even realize kind of what I was doing, but I was building the skills I would need. And then two things actually got me to write the first novel I wrote. One was I took a class at the Writer's Center called How to Write a Lot. And it was a 2-hour class. But the biggest thing was, and the biggest thing I learned was that this sounds really obvious, and I don't want to give away all her secrets, some of which helped me. But you just have to write. Like, you just have to keep going forward. And I was someone who, one of the reasons I couldn't write a novel was because I couldn't get those first 5 or 10 pages good. And, later, and it's still true, like I can't get those 5 or 10 pages good in my first draft now, even though I've written multiple novels and published multiple novels. Like, and so you can spend all day trying to get those, or week or year trying to get those first pages right. But that's really something for after you've written the story, or if you're like me, after you've written the story 3 or 4 times. um, and the second thing is, it's in a similar vein. I heard Kate DiCamillo speak at the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. And someone asked her a question. I think it was about Despereaux, but I could be wrong about that, but about one book. And so the question wasn't even about her process. The question was about this book. And she said, that book came really quite easily to me, and she's talking more about it. She said, I only did like 3 or 4 drafts really, whereas usually I do 8 to 10. And I know I should have been horrified, but instead I felt it was a lightning bolt of joy. I was like, oh, I have like 8 to 10 drafts to
Yes.
make. Like, I don't actually have to get this right in 2 drafts, because I will be honest with you, my second drafts are not good. They're still really bad. Really bad. I mean, they often don't make sense, and that's okay because they're almost like notes to myself. But being able to kind of liberate myself from trying to get something perfect on the computer and just getting words down and giving myself something to respond to and something to think through. And knowing that, like, a friend of mine once was really struggling with her novel, and she's like, well, I wrote it, I'm mixing it up in one, either first or third person. She's like, and I think it needs to be the reverse. And I was like, she's like, so I have to start over. And I was like, well, why don't you just start writing it in that tense now? And she's like, because it's half written in the other tense. And I was like, but it's just a document on your computer.
Yeah.
Like, that's all it is. Like, you don't need to put so much weight on it. And that doesn't mean I don't love or feel very seriously about my books, or sometimes disagree with my editor on some things that have to happen. Not in a, she's wonderful, but in a, I don't think that's true for the story arc way. Is there another way to get at what the problem is in that way? Let's think creatively, because I know if I write it X way instead of Y way, it won't feel honest to me. So how do we find another way to address what are always legitimate concerns? But so yeah. So anyway, that's a very long answer to how I got to be a writer. So then very quickly, if people are interested in terms of like process wise, that first novel, I eventually finished. I got a lot of interest when I was querying it, but like I kept not kind of getting over the line. And then I did some revise and resubmits, and eventually I had a handful of offers and signed with an agent, but it didn't sell. And then I landed up switching agents for my second novel. And I also want to make clear, my first agent is like a wonderful person and a very nice, smart person. It was just a question of fit. And it became clear that not even so much what she was saying was wrong, but what I wanted to do with my work, like, we might not have been the perfect fit. I recommended other people query her. She's wonderful. But I then, for my second book, which turned out to be The View from the Very Best House in Town, and I say turned out to be The View from the Very Best House in Town because that book had so many titles. Like, even when I queried it, if you look at different query letters, it has different titles and different.
Oh,
um, but I queried that for a few months and was very lucky to get an offer of representation from Meera Trehan, who's just fantastic. And I did a revision with her, and then we went out on submission and sold The View from the Very Best House in Town, which I think only had that name in the submission letter. That was like the first time it had that.
I love knowing that. I love little tidbits like that authors drop here on the podcast.
Uh,
So one thing I love about your story, and you say it's long, but I say it's perfect because that's the exact kind of detail that I think listeners just really want to know about the authors that they love, is that it's this stance of just keep writing. Just keep writing and keep learning and keep trying, and it's just something that gets better and better and better. And so many of us, I had to giggle when you said, why does she get to call herself a writer, right? Because it's our the things we envy and the things we're jealous about that give us the little snippets of what we want. But I think so many people think, well, I couldn't be a writer. I couldn't do that. I couldn't write a book like that. And the reality is, and what I love that your story seems to share with readers and with listeners, is that it's a skill. It's a skill that you build and you love it and you can learn, and it does not come right on the first draft or maybe even the second, but you keep going, and then look what you can get with all of that. I love how you took us from the beginning to the book to really see and appreciate how much goes into it.
And I think one thing that's really hard is there's sort of this idea like, oh, you're a good writer. And, I was a lawyer and wrote a lot. And I was a good writer before, like at the beginning of that story in a lot of ways, but that didn't mean I knew how to write a book.
Right.
And there's sort of this feeling like, oh, if I'm a good athlete, I mean, or conversely, we don't have the feeling if I'm a good athlete, I should be able to make it to the Olympics, or I dance well. Okay, I'm going to go dance ballet professionally, like, or I'm musical, but now I'm going to be on the radio, but it's a very, very competitive industry. And honestly, and it takes luck too. You have to get better. And there's for the best writers, there's still going to be luck, right? So there's so much out of your control. And what you can control is the writing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why you have to be doing it too, right? Because you love it. Because there are no guarantees, which is so difficult. And compared to law, where it was like, okay, well, I do this and I do that. And if you're in a firm, it's very hierarchical. But even if you're not in a law firm, there's certain sort of more well-trod paths. You
Mhm.
know, I'm sure, I don't even know how many people you've interviewed, but I bet every single one of us is a somewhat different path, right?
Yes. Yeah. 111 so far, 111 different paths.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so I think it just makes me appreciate what holding a book in my hands actually means, from all of the years of work that it took an author to get there. And you talked about your first book, and now today we're talking about Snow. I adored this book, Meera. Oh my goodness. I am not typically a fantasy reader, at least in an adult fiction kind of world. I love them more in middle grade. I don't know if it was the characters, if it was the very cool things about the snow, if it was the special book, if it was the royalty. I don't know what it was, but all wrapped together. I just kept turning the pages and trying to figure out what was going on. And I loved it. I loved it. And I know I just kind of dropped a few things that might give readers an idea about the book, but for the listener that hasn't read it yet, could you tell us just a little bit about the book, with no spoilers, of course, but a little bit about the book and the inspiration behind it, because it is different. It's different than your first book. So I'd love to know this path.
Sure. Well, so one funny thing, you said you weren't typically a fantasy reader. I didn't think I could be after my first book, which I mean, it's one can question whether in some ways it is like realistic fiction, but also a house with a really big attitude narrates a third of it. So
You
it's definitely got a twist on it. So I don't want to say like I wrote total realistic fiction, but even so, and some of my friends are like, you wrote a book that a house was talking. How can you say this? But I'm going to say it. I did not think I could write a fantasy novel, and I wasn't trying to write a fantasy novel. And initially, but because I didn't think I could write a fantasy novel, and therefore I wasn't writing a fantasy novel, I said, totally straight faced, sitting at a table at the Highlights Foundation to one of my dear friends. At the time, I don't think we didn't know each other as well. And the fact that she smiled, nodded when I said this, I think shows why she became a dear friend. I was like, so I'm not writing a fantasy. I'm just writing a realistic fiction book with magic snow and princess. And she was like, really? And I was like, "Mhm. I just don't know where I'd start with fantasy." She's like, in middle grade? I was like, yeah. She's like, because back to my previous thing, it's like whatever you need to do to trick your brain into getting through the draft. And
Yes.
if like you need to tell yourself, I needed to tell myself it was doable somehow. And and so writing a fantasy about this whole world, it would have just felt too overwhelming. But it is a book about a princess who is isolated in this kingdom of magic snow that refills itself. And so what that means is if you step in it, um, you lift up your foot, the footprint will fill in. If you drop something in it, the it will fill in and it will look perfect and smooth, kind of no matter what. And as I say on the first page, enough snow can conceal anything.
Mhm.
And so the princess is in this kingdom digging, and she's in a land called Mistmere that's surrounded by mists. And on in the very first chapter, so no spoilers, she's digging this endless snow, and then a foot comes through the mist. And before she can kind of talk to the person, the foot disappears. However, the person whose foot that is comes back the next day, and they embark on a journey where each realizes that they have a connection to the other, and each has their own motives for kind of staying around and trying to figure out what they can get from the other and how the other can serve their ends. All in this land with magic snow and robotic hounds and a castle and
Yes, and flutterflies,
yes,
and
flutterby.
sun apples, and so many wonderful things.
And that was one of the fun things about writing the book, but also to the kind of, I want, in a way, I wanted it to feel like realistic fiction in the sense that you felt like it was real and it could be happening. And some of it was even like the word choices, like naming a fruit sun apple. Like we all might have a sense of what that might taste like or look like without, if I called it, I don't know, like Baju joust, you'd be like,
Right.
whatever, like giving you little hints of how it is sort of connected. And the two worlds are connected, as we find out.
Yes, and that I'm glad you said that because while you were kind of tricking yourself into the idea that you weren't writing a fantasy, it does feel as if you're reading it that this is a very logical thing that could happen. You could stumble upon someone. You could try to figure out your connection. Maybe there aren't robotic, hounds and things, but the connections between the girls that you find out, the family things that you find out, the themes that are there as both think about their lives do feel very, very real. And I really wish the snow was real. I had such a good time imagining what that would be, and you even give us little hints of the science from the hydrologists that are in there. So I did have a really good time visualizing what an amazing place that would be.
Yeah. And for me as a writer, I mean, and one thing with all the drafts, I remember being like, I could never write, 50,000 words or 60, whatever word count you think, 60,000 words, they're not like going for. And then, of course, like, I mean, I write so many times that getting to a book. But I really, really have to understand how a world works before I can write in it. again, like that has to be, so I had to kind of figure that out. And for me, I'm kind of, I like science. And my husband is a physicist, and so we spent a lot of time talking about the science. But I kind of needed to understand, even in my own, even though this was magic, like I couldn't just make it up for convenience, if that made sense.
Mhm.
Or if I wanted something to happen with the snow, I need to know why it happened and all of that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I do kind of pepper the science hints in there,
Yeah.
because I want there to be, I want it to feel real, and for readers to be able to buy into the world the way I did.
I think that's why I bought into it so quickly as someone who doesn't normally gravitate towards fantasy because of what you were just saying of a name of a fruit that I can't just wrap my head around. I could wrap my head around all of these elements, especially that snow, which was so fun to imagine. And I'm glad that you said that because I was going to ask how, and it's so hard because I don't want to give spoilers to the book, but there's conceptualizing that world, the snow, what happens, and then how the girls are connected. I guess I would just love to ask how how do you go about imagining that world? You say it's got to be logical and you've maybe
Yeah.
talked your husband into some conversations, but how do you do that first?
And I think this is the key to writing a book, and why having so many drafts, kind of going back to that, is like you have to have kind of one thing, you have to have something that's pulling you through the story. And for me, it was the snow.
Mhm.
And so, excuse me, kind of funny name thing on titles. Snow was just what it was called on my hard drive. And I was like, surely they'll make me change the name at some point. But I was like, I can't think of what else to call it. But surely at some point they'll be like, we can't just call this book Snow. And then I got the mock-ups of the cover, and like snow was on it in big
Yeah.
letters. And I was like, oh, okay, we're doing this.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, for me, something kind of, I'll talk about themes in a second, but plot wise, there has to be something pulling me through, and some question, and something I find really intriguing. And I don't want to give too much away on what I was thinking with the snow, because it will,
Yeah.
but I had a dream about snow like this. And it was very visceral and very emotional. And I started asking questions about, well, how would the snow have gotten like this? Who would be the people who would have come in contact with the snow? And that's sort of how I started building it out. But one thing that's interesting, we talk about Princess. I am, so we know that. Separately, I had written, when at one of the times I wasn't working on anything. I don't know if I'd even started writing or not. Maybe I'd written my first novel, but the one that didn't get published but got agented. I'm not exactly sure, but it was a long time ago. I just sat down and wrote Once Upon a Time, and I started writing this. And I said something like, there was a king who, like, I said it better than this, but basically thought he was so great. And then I turned into his first daughter's birthday party, which is actually a scene in the first chunk of the book. When I wrote that, just as like a piece of writing, just like I should sit and make myself sit down and write something, I didn't know where it was going. It was years later that I was writing Snow, and I was like, wait, I think that's in this book. Like, can I put that in this book? And if I put that in this book, then what does it do to the world? And what does it do to the characters? And who else is in this? I mean, that was obviously pretty early on in the process, but also when it's kind of like science and scientific discoveries. You might be like, well, why are we studying this? And then, 50 years later, you're like, oh, that molecule is actually really beneficial in this medicine or whatever, or has this effect, and you don't know. I mean, it's the same thing with writing. Sometimes you don't necessarily know where it's going for it to become a cornerstone of something you do later.
Which goes back to your point of just keep writing.
Yeah.
Just
But
keep
also, I'm going to say something convert like the opposite of that, sort of, which is another reason why I feel like I have to tell the story, because it's so easy. And so many writers kind of beat themselves up for not writing. And one of another very formative experience I had at the Writers Center was I took a class on novel writing, because then I was like, oh, I should write this novel. And you had to submit your first 25 pages for a review. And I did the first class or two, and I reviewed other people's work. Um, but what I realized is I was not going to be able to get my 25 pages. And even though I had the idea for the novel, I just wasn't going to be able to. So after a couple of weeks, I decided to drop out. Um, which I really, and I still would say in that amount of time, I couldn't have written anything. Here's my feeling on feedback. You of course need feedback, but I think a lot of writers get feedback too soon on their work. And you want to have some sense of what the work is. You want to be at a place where feedback's going to be helpful, and not when you're so insecure or so in the beginnings of figuring things out that like things can just be blown away like a house of cards. You want some sense of what you're trying to do with your work. And there's no way I would have gotten there then. And in fact, it was 3 or 4 years till I sat down and actually tried to write the 3 years maybe. So, I was right. I couldn't write the novel then. Um, and I just expected the teacher to be like, well, okay, but real writers write every day, or I don't know, something.
Mhm.
And she was just like, yeah. And she had published, between 3 and 5 novels at the time. It was published a number more since then. But she was just like, yeah, sometimes life is like that. Like, that's okay. And I was just like, I wish, like, I'd love for you to stay, but, like, of course you can get back to it. And that permission giving to make writing like a positive thing I do for me and not something I owe to someone, unless I'm on deadline, but that's a different thing now. But like when you're not, unless you have a contractual obligation, you're doing it for yourself first and foremost. So like there is a lot of work and you should just keep writing. And it's very good to set, I set word count limits or other things to sort of force myself to keep at it. But that's still for me. And if I'm not doing it, I don't have to feel, I mean, again, it's something I fight against, but it's not, it honestly, like the energy you spend saying like, oh, I didn't do it. And I like, it's not useful. If you're not going to do it, go out and do something else you're enjoying doing and live your life. And if you are doing it, great. And if you need to set up structures to help make yourself right, which almost everyone does, that's fine. But keep doing it, but not in a way that you're beating yourself up when you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good just life lesson in general, I think. For writing and for everything else that we attempt to tackle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, in the book, we already talked about some of the really fun kind of fantasy elements, the snow, um, flutterflies, butterflies, cuddle lumps, sun apples, all of those wonderful things. But we also talked about how it does still feel very real. And I want listeners to know that there are so many entry points that I think a reader could find themselves in, whether it's thinking about friendship and school experiences that some of us experience, whether it's the family connection, whether it's just trying to believe in yourself. There are so many places, I think, where a reader can make a connection. And I was just so in awe of how you had this really wonderful fantasy element, but you had so many themes of that family, that friendship. Be careful what you wish for, what's real, what's not, what's truth, what's so many things that you balanced in there. And I'd love for you to talk for a minute just about those kind of real world themes that readers might find themselves connecting to. Because I know I did.
No, thank you. So, I was saying like I need something to pull me through the story. And I'd say it's sort of like I need two things. I need one thing at like the kind of surface level, because I'm a big believer, and one reason I like writing for children. I think a book, no matter how philosophical it's going to be, no matter how much it's going to tell you about living your life. And I hope like the best books do leave you changed or thinking about how you want to live your life. So I do think that's ideal in a book. But to me, none of that matters. And none of that will actually take hold unless it's a good story, first and foremost. And so that's right where the snow comes in. And that's kind of gets the story. But for me, as I mentioned, I'm writing for myself. And a lot of that comes to kind of writing and grappling with these big questions that you have for yourself and seeing if other people also have those questions, when you connect with readers. And so for me, questions were like, how do you forgive yourself and move past the mistakes you've made? When you really feel like you've done things that even if other people forgive you, you don't, and you feel like are keeping you stuck. How, what makes you matter as a person? And this is a theme in my first book with kids, you know, are we telling kids one, like kindness matters while we're really rewarding other kinds of achievement? And what messages then are we sending to kids if we're really like telling them to be kind in preschool, but then, when they get to late elementary school and middle school, really just talking about grades or ultimately colleges or this or that. I think to me, I see a big disconnect there in kind of the messages that we're sending. So a lot of the themes, and then the importance of family, there are themes about migration and science and all of that. And those are things I think about. And, you know, everyone kind of, but families and friendships, I think those connections, it's something that we're all thinking about and struggling. And luckily my family does not bear a resemblance to the princesses. um, I don't have a power mad king as a father, which is a great thing. Um, but but I think the emotions that different people are feeling, the jealousy, the loss, the, wanting to be a favorite, the sense of abandonment, the, feeling like you're never measuring up, all of that is something we all feel in relationships, and how we manage that, and how we kind of recognize those feelings and use them for good, not bad, I think are things that are just really universal. And there are things I'm thinking about. And so, as I said, I have to write things I feel like are true. And so it's not like I'm necessarily consciously weaving those themes in, but I am trying to write something really honest. And then that's how it comes out. And the many drafts help kind of the layers, because then you're like, oh, I can put a little bit of this in here. Oh, now I look at that and that connects here and here and here.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't, no one else can see. And I don't know if it comes through, but I've got so many little flags and sticky notes of the places that made me think, or the lines that I loved. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to share a line that I can't stop thinking about since that my adult self needed as I was reading the book. And even though it's towards the end of the book, I don't it's not really a spoiler. It's just a gem of a line. Is it okay if I share it?
Yeah, of course. Of
Okay.
course.
And I won't share the context, because listeners, you're just going to have to go read the book and get the context. But the line that I just can't get out of my head that I really needed was this: the reason she matters is because she's her. Just that theme of mattering exactly as you are, no matter what that is. I my I cry easily, but that one really got me.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that is, I often start my books sort of with questions. And that was sort of one of the questions. And then when I answer for them myself, like, a year and a half later, when I'm finishing off the book, I'm like, was it always that simple? Did I need to write this whole book together? And it's all right, because, like, you know, it was always that simple. And yet, when we get so caught up in life, you can just forget what you already know. I mean, and maybe writing, that's part of what, like, helping you slow down and find those things again. I'm glad you like that line. That line meant a lot to me too.
It's in my quote journal, and it's on a sticky note on my office wall. So it's permanent.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that resonates, because I mean, there's two storylines, but I mean, for one of them, that's right. That's the heart of the whole storyline for her.
Yeah.
That's why she goes through the 200 pages she does to get to
Yes.
that one.
Yes. And this is where I wish we could talk about the ending, because oh my gosh, Mira, the ending. The ending was just, oh, I and I can't I'll tell you off camera how much I love it, but the ending's good, listeners. It's that fuzzy buzzy feeling of, oh, this is it.
This is a writer, and not, this might sound braggy, and I don't mean it, but like when I got to the ending, which wasn't like the very last draft, like I had that ending, in the scheme. I had the very beginning and the very end, relatively early in the process, which might mean halfway through, whatever.
But like sometimes you're like, this is good. This is where I need to end. And my editor loved the ending from the beginning. But if she had been like, change the ending, I'd have been like, no, we're going to change all the stuff that leads up to the ending. Cause I was like, I knew that was how it kind of had to end. And similarly with the beginning, it was sort of like where it ends and where it begins, right? There it's not like in the yin and the yang, like they have to be in balance with each other and it has to connect. So I'm glad you like the ending because I'm proud of that ending.
Yes,
I
I
really
loved it. Listeners are going to love it. I feel like we've dropped enough hints and little, surprises throughout that they just need to go get it. They need to see where that line came from. They need to see the ending we're talking about. They need to visualize that snow in a way that they can't until they read the book. It's
they
just
know what
wonderful.
a flutterby actually is.
That's right. That's right. And the cuddle lump. Got to know.
Yeah, Cuddle Lump was a late addition too to the book. Cuddle
Oh,
Lump
okay.
was like the book was it was after I got kind of my first real edit letter, and there were a lot of things my editor recommended I do, and basically I'm proud of myself for Cuddle Lump because sometimes you come up with a solution. I think for the writers who are listening, um, often in revision, the best solutions are ones that can hit a lot of different points all with one change. And so Cuddle Lump helped me, like,
Yes.
I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. But then, like, where are all the places I can connect to make this feel organic with the story? And, like, if I'm doing this one thing, how can I commit to have this change in my book? I do think that's one important thing with a revision. Like, I usually rewrite from scratch each draft. And part of that is so that I'm truly like, so it feels cohesive and it's not just like, oh, I just stuck these two scenes in, but like, if this is how we're doing it, then how are we doing all of the story and kind of mentioning all of it?
So yet another reason to appreciate holding the book. The revision is literally a brand new draft. My goodness. Oh, well, I
And
love
at the very, the last thing I want to say, I do want to clarify at the very, very end, like the last ones, once my editor got it back, they weren't all of like, I would say maybe I would take 20 pages and rewrite those. But that's pretty close. And yeah, I do a lot of draft. And I want to just say, I really think you can get your best work out that way. Oh, and read it all out loud. That too. Got to read it out loud.
oh, well, it just makes me appreciate the book, all books really, but especially this book even more, kind of knowing about that process. And I hope listeners will go out and grab it. You don't have to read it in the winter like I did. You can read it at any time and get lost in that snowy world. Oh, so where can listeners, oh, actually, no, before I wanted to ask, is there anything else that you can sneak peek us into? Anything on the horizon?
No sneak peeks yet. I do have a project that hoping I'm hoping might make its way in the world. And then, kind of in that whole writing is never wasted, hopefully true. I had an idea, years ago that I did some writing, on and then it just sort of never went anywhere. And I just sort of picked that back up and I'm trying to play with form and see if I can make a draft out of all my random notes and characters. And kind of story idea and questions, kind of trying to merge that into something that will make sense to someone other than myself. Nothing I can talk about now, but definitely I'm still working and you know, hoping it goes somewhere.
Yes. Well, where can listeners find you online so they can keep track of those things that might come in the future? Where's the best place to find you?
Sure, I am more of a lurker than a poster, although I do post some and I do post developments. But I'm always happy to connect with readers and listeners. I'm on Blue Sky, again with my name, Meera Trehan, and on Instagram. And I also have a website, meeratrehan.com. And if folks are interested in school visits or book club visits, or library visits, book festivals, any of that, there is a form on my website, both on the contact page and on the visits page. So, um,
Well, I also want to point out there's some beautiful discussion guides on your website for educators, librarians, anybody who wants to talk about this book. There are some really beautiful questions on there. So I want to make sure listeners know to go find those on your site too.
Thank you. Yes. And a shout out to Candlewick, my publisher, for working to get those together for both my books.
Well, I'll make sure to put links to all those places, your website, your social media handles, and certainly links to both of your books that we talked about today in the episode to make it as easy as we can for people to find you and your books. And I just want to thank you. This is such a wonderful conversation. I feel like I have such a better appreciation, even after 100 episodes, of how much goes into the book that I enjoy in my hands. So thank you so much for coming on today.
And thank you so much for having me and for the work you do promoting middle grade.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.